Welcome environmental advocates. With the release of Virginia's Conservation Network's R2023 Common Agenda Briefing Book, for Virginia's environmental advocates and policymakers have access to our upcoming environmental policy goals. As with each year's agenda, the over 38 issue papers have been crafted by our 150 plus network partners. Each Thursday in October and the first week of November from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., the Our Common Agenda Education Series will highlight the state-based policy recommendations throughout the 5 chapters of VCN's briefing book, which are clean water and flood resilience, land and wildlife conservation, land use and transportation, which is today, climate and energy, and good governance. Each Thursday, we will be joined by authors from these policy papers. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it off to Wyatt Gordon with VCN.
Hey everyone, I am Wyatt Gordon, as Kyle said. I do policy and campaigns on land use and transportation, and I'm going to be your MC today. So first off, we're going to start from the very beginning. The person with perhaps the best overview of transportation policy in Virginia, and that is Trip Pollard at the Southern Environmental Law Center, and he's going to tell you all a little bit more about how we can transform the way we do transportation.
Thanks, Wyatt. So the Transforming Transportation paper I wrote with Victoria Higgins with CCAN, who's also part of the panel today. And this is sort of a framework paper for much of the land use and transportation chapter of our common agenda. And so next slide, if we could advance. It's really based on the fundamental fact that Virginia needs a cleaner, more equitable transportation system. We've made some really important progress in a number of areas in recent years. But the fundamental fact is we're still spending way too much of our transportation money on destructive highway projects. And we are still giving most people far few meaningful practical alternatives to driving. So what this portion of our common agenda looks at is some of the ways we try to address some of these challenges, because our current approach is causing a wide range of environmental destruction. Transportation, by far the largest source of carbon pollution in Virginia, among many other problems. And again, most people really don't have many meaningful opportunities to drive most of the time. So we really need to change a system that focuses so heavily on highway expansion and construction. Progress has stalled a bit under the new administration and with the divided General Assembly. Our current system is very costly to taxpayers, our health, and the environment. So what we then do, if you could move to the next slide, is given these many challenges, and I just touched on climate in particular, but there's a lot of other air pollutants and water pollutants from transportation. And I will also note that these pollutants have a disproportionate impact on communities of color and under-resourced communities. So given these challenges, the key recommendations in this paper are, first, we've got to fund cleaner transportation choices. And that means increasing the share of state, regional money that goes to transit, rail, bicycle, pedestrian projects. One important area of opportunity, both for funding some clean transportation projects, but also it's an area of potential additional damage, is the new Federal Infrastructure Act. So both there are chunks of this money that are formula money that Virginia just gets automatically, and there's discretionary money we'll have to compete for. So one of our main focuses administratively, and then some on the legislative front, is going to be trying to put some guardrails around how Virginia spends that money and to promote cleaner transportation projects. Second is strengthening the fix-it-first requirement that's actually in the state code, but not always followed, and allocating our money to make sure that we first cover maintaining and repairing our existing infrastructure before moving on to new construction. The third recommendation is defending smart scale and opposing efforts to fund specific projects outside of prioritization process. Smart Scale is Virginia's award-winning program that is much more objective way of scoring and funding potential transportation projects. It's resulted in much greater funding of clean transportation projects than we were seeing before, but it's under attack, both in the General Assembly and administratively. So that is a key area of policy solutions that we will be working on in the coming year. Fourth is prioritizing carbon reduction in transportation planning and funding. There are a whole lot of ways we can do this. One I just want to mention again is the Federal Infrastructure Act. It has a number of areas, particularly one on carbon reduction program that Virginia will be developing a plan for. And I think this is a real important opportunity to weigh in to get and weave carbon reduction more prominently into our transportation planning and funding. And the final policy solution I'd like to touch on is setting specific goals to reduce the amount of driving we do, vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. And that's a long-term proposal and project. But again, there's a lot of things we can do in the shorter term, and that's mainly these funding paths that I mentioned and defending of Smart Scale. And also it will weave into many of the topics that you're about to hear from. So thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Trip. That really set the stage for where we're about to go. So, we're always trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled. The easiest way to do that is by helping people to live closer to all the things that they want to be around anyway. So up next, we have Karen Campblin with the Sierra Club, who's going to be talking about how we can boost our smart growth and help to incentivize development in the places where we already have infrastructure, and not just sprawl out and ruin all of our forests and farmland. So I'll pass it over to Karen.
Thank you, Wyatt. It is fantastic to be here, and thank you so much. Let me do this. And so, as Wyatt said, I'm here just to talk about and present the policy recommendations for boosting smarter growth. Again, my name is Karen Campblin, and I worked on this with Stuart Schwartz from the Coalition for Smarter Growth, who was unable to join us today, but he, as you know, is very heavily involved in these policy pursuits. And so let me try and figure out how does this work. And so just briefly before I get to our policy recommendations, I just wanted to kind of highlight what we discussed for our challenges and what our solutions were. And of course, boosting for smarter growth has been a priority for VCN and its partners for several years, because we understand how important it is to combine and integrate land use, transportation planning, as well as environmental planning to ensure that we have sustainable and viable communities. And to move away from some of the past poor planning methods that encourage sprawling and leapfrogging. And as you know, those created some really ill effects, such as extending or overextending municipalities or jurisdictions' ability to care for and provide the proper level of service, but it also helped to perpetuate discrimination within our land use and our housing options, as well as put in several or different types of families and individuals at a disadvantage as to how close they could live to where they work, get education, get their medical services, and play, and as well as religious and as well as faith opportunities. And so what our solutions were to correct those changes, rebuild some of those in areas where we can, and to try and make sure that we have a variety of opportunities and options within the built environment before we move on to further pursuing green fields or new areas for expansion. There's a lot of things that we can do within the existing built environment, particularly maintaining and improving our existing infrastructure, which we know those repairs are far exceed municipalities' budget. So we really need to look at what we have before we build anew. And so with the spirit of that, we came up with these policy recommendations. And so basically to adopt that fix it first requirement within our Virginia codes and to minimize the greenfield development, and so we no longer get those ill effects of sprawl and those leapfrog developments that we are currently experiencing. And in addition to that, going back to decreasing vehicles miles travel, having a more compact growth will help with that. And then of course, affordable housing, prioritizing funding for affordable housing by putting $200 million per year for the state affordable housing trust fund within the 3 years, and prioritizing infill projects. And all of this, as I mentioned, will help increase our housing option. And in some areas, we've identified that single family zoning has created a massive barrier for allowing these types of things. You've heard terms such as middle housing or triplexes, fourplexes, and those types of things. So trying to change our codes to allow these types of housing options to be in the middle of things instead of the periphery and at a further disadvantage. And then, of course, we've been hearing a lot of this stuff, particularly during the COVID pandemic. It really highlighted that there were some discriminatory laws that are still on the books. So really taking a concerted and conscious effort to remove those barriers from our Virginia codes to allow for more equitable planning in our planning, our land use, our transportation, our housing, and all of those different types of codes in which we all use to help guide our smart growth policies. And then require mega site incentive programs and siting to include the review of scale, location, impact of new and proposed distribution and data centers. And this is really important as we start to move to the clean energy economy, that we make sure that we are really taking a smart and concerted effort in how these things are cited, how they're scored, how they're funded. And again, with a major focus on staying within our built environment. So starting to look at not only infill, but what can we do to mitigate lands that have already been, that are had its previous toxic or harmful practices. What do we do to get it into the brownfield program so we can use that as a redevelopment site and it will no longer stays as an unused parcel. And so that concludes the policy recommendation for boosting smarter growth, and I look forward to the question section. Thank you. Thank you, Wyatt.
Hey, thank you, Karen. Thanks for that overview. Okay, up next, we know that highways are incredibly polluting. Some of our communities in Virginia that have astronomical rates of asthma are right next to highway corridors. So we know the connections are there, but how do we make those for lawmakers? How do we make that connection for the general public? And most importantly, what do we do to reduce vehicle pollution now while we're waiting for electrification to kind of speed up? How are we actually helping these communities that are impacted by all of the particulate matter and carbon pollution? So to speak on that front, I have an esteemed healthcare professional who knows everything about the public health of vehicle pollution to explain to y'all some of the ways that we're thinking about how to reduce vehicle pollution. So Bob Kitchen with the Virginia Clinicians for Climate Action, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Wyatt. And thanks for that esteemed.
Oh, Bob, you're
there we go. I'm sorry.
There you go.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Well, thanks, Wyatt and Nicole, when the slides come up. And I also wanted to acknowledge that Karen is wearing two hats she helped me with this section as well. So thanks, Karen, and I appreciated your presentation. Nicole, the next slide. The statement on the right-hand side gives an indication of how significant transportation is in terms of greenhouse gases in Virginia. So 47% of CO2 emissions in Virginia come from transportation versus a national average of 27%. And the challenges that come from this: fine particulate matter, which is a major component of transportation pollution, can injure a person's respiratory and cardiovascular systems. In a study that BCCA commissioned and released about 2 years ago, it was found that on an annual basis, Virginia-specific transportation, just cars driven in Virginia, causes 92 excess deaths, 2,600 cases of exacerbated asthma, 10,000 lost work days, and generates additional health costs of $750 million. When you factor in the pollution that comes from transportation crossing state borders, this more than doubles these numbers. The people who suffer the most tend to contribute the least to the transportation generated pollution. And deaths associated with this pollution are 61% higher in low income, older, BIPOC, and minority populations. Next slide. I put this graphic in to just give you an idea about the mechanism of how transportation damages your health. The graphic on the right-hand side shows, one second, I'm gonna step out. Graphic on the right-hand side shows in the little red dot, particulate matter 2.5, which is a major pollutant for transportation. And that is 2.5 microns. Compare that to PM10, which is what dust and pollen particles are sized. And these are compared to a human hair as well as a grain of sand. So incredibly small toxic particle, which, as you can see on the right-hand side, when inhaled, gets to the furthest reaches of the pulmonary system and can cross the very thin membrane in the alveoli and get absorbed into the circulation. And from there, it is taken to the various organs in the body, and through an inflammatory process sets off the injury that occurs. Next slide. I apologize. It's hard to find a quiet place at the airport. Air pollution also impacts agriculture, a multi-billion-dollar industry in Virginia, by decreasing crop yields and raising plant susceptibility to disease and pests. Pollutants such as sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide particles create toxic rain, which contaminates soil and bodies of water. And this can lead to biodiversity reduction, habitat degradation, and negative impacts on Virginia's aquaculture industry. Next slide. So we've got three sets of solutions with associated policies. And the first is to continue to support efforts to implement equitable and emission standards and promote EV use, including school buses. And this policy would be to support the recommendations that were in accelerating transportation electrification in page 63 of the common agenda, to include protecting and advancing of Virginia's clean car standards and funding for the Virginia Electric Vehicle Grant Fund to support school districts obtaining electric buses. Next slide. Next is to invest in robust statewide air quality monitoring systems so we can find out where the pollution is the greatest and how we can really address in that area. And so we recommend commissioning a study by the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission to determine the capability of the current air quality monitoring system and identify the need for additional monitors, specific impacted locations with consideration to environmental justice, and how to best fast track implementation. Next slide. And the last one is to recognizing that native trees and vegetation can play a significant role in reducing transportation around roadways, support policy recommendations in increasing the investment in trees, which is on page 63 of the common agenda, to ensure proper funding is allocated to the Department of Forestry's Urban and Community Forestry Grant Program. And Wyatt, that takes care of it, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for dealing with those harrowing conditions to still give a coherent presentation to us. I was chuckling to myself because I was like, you know, you can tell he knows this stuff to be walking, talking, having doors closing, you know, in and out, you know, this policy. So thank you for presenting and for sharing it with us.
Pleasure. Bye.
Okay, our next presenter is going to be sharing with us some of VCN's work and all of our partners' work on how do we accelerate transportation electrification. You know, we know electric vehicles are incredibly better for our health, for the climate, and for our communities than a lot of our existing fossil fuel based cars. So how do we make that happen as fast as possible, Blair?
Wyatt, I am so glad you asked. So hi, everyone. Like Wyatt said, and I'm gonna, yep, there we go. Lovely front slide. My name is Blair St. Ledger-Olson, and I'm the Legislative Director for Climate Cabinet Education and our affiliated Action Fund. So we're a national nonprofit using data science to find and support policymakers with policy solutions, just like we're going to talk about today. I was thrilled to once again author the Accelerating Transportation Electrification paper, along with my co-authors, Lena Lewis from the Nature Conservancy and Dakri Goodisolo from Electrification Coalition, along with so many other people who you're even hearing from on today's call. Next slide. Fantastic. So far today, we've discussed the role that the transportation sector plays in Virginia's public health, our economy, and for all of us here, our environment. So you'll hear even more about the importance of reducing vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, and expanding public transit access soon. But today, I'm here to specifically talk about transportation electrification. So to comprehensively address vehicle pollution, cleaner transportation alternatives such as transit and rail need to be expanded. We need thoughtful land use incentivized and pursued. But we have to simultaneously accelerate transportation electrification to eliminate the emissions from the remaining vehicles. So like Bob was saying, like Tripp has said, like even Karen said, the transportation sector is the Commonwealth's #1 source of carbon emissions. So this work is actually that much more important for Virginia's access to clean air and water. Now, modeling done by the Rocky Mountain Institute shows that the United States writ large needs to reduce VMT by 20% to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. However, a 20% reduction in Virginia's VMT, which is 234 million miles a day, is still 187 million miles traveled, or vehicle miles traveled rather, on a daily basis. So we need complementary solutions that work together to reduce VMT while electrifying those rides that remain. Now, currently in Virginia, less than 1% of the vehicles on our road are now electric. So that means we have to accelerate the electrification of cars, trucks, buses, even trains in the Commonwealth. Thankfully, reducing VMT and transportation electrification are mutually reinforcing solutions. Fewer vehicles that we have to electrify, the easier this is. But accelerating EV adoption has some of its own unique barriers, such as the challenges you see here, like a higher upfront cost and gaps in charging infrastructure. Next slide. Now, thankfully, there is already constituent support for the types of policy solutions that accelerate transportation electrification. Polling shows that 70% of Virginians support state investment in modernizing and electrifying its transportation sector, including state-level electric vehicle incentives. Now, in 2021, the General Assembly did a lot to tackle transportation, including codifying some of the most equitably designed financial incentive structure in the country. Those programs were created to help Virginians overcome the higher upfront cost of electric vehicles, electric school buses, EV bikes, even EV charging infrastructure. However, due to the financial uncertainty that we were in at the time, the programs were left unfunded. This is no longer the case, though, as the Commonwealth has more than rebounded from the initial economic downturn caused by the pandemic. Our economy is thriving, so it's really time to fund these programs. In addition to dedicated state funding, you heard Tripp talk about the new federal program. So Virginia needs to take advantage of these newly available federal funds to support infrastructure deployment. And in doing so, we need to ensure meaningful stakeholder engagement while prioritizing under-resourced communities across all investments. Now, most important from my perspective is how these programs work hand in hand with our existing participation in the Advanced Clean Car Standards, which is critical to securing Virginia's access to the newest and most technologically advanced electric vehicles. This program survived multiple legislative attacks during the 2022 session, and it must continue to be a top defensive priority in 2023. We have already seen 3 bills introduced to take Virginia out of this program. Combined, though, if we can hold the line on all of our priorities, these policy solutions will continue to accelerate electric mobility adoption in the Commonwealth. And I'm looking forward to working with all of you to do just that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Blair. So we have made it through the first half of our segment on land use and transportation reform. We are going to do a 10-minute question and answer portion. So please submit your questions in the chat box for our panelists to answer. Anything that you want to know more information about, that you're excited about of the policies they brought forward, or if you're curious if they're running specific bills on these things and how you can get involved to help them pass, now is your time. And then after we do some questions on this subsection, we're going to move into walking, biking, trains, and public transit. So land use and transportation. And if we don't get any questions, we can just move on into the second portion of our.
There are some questions why it looks like under the Q&A
Yep.
tab.
That's what I was about to flag.
They're not in the chat.
Okay. How do I access the Q&A tab?
All right.
Q&A.
I got a great
Okay.
question.
Nope,
for
I
Trip.
found it. I found it. Okay. Robert asked, this one will be for Trip, I'm sure. Please explain how Smart Scale works and how it provides priority funding for transit, pedestrian, and bicycling, or does it? And also might be helpful just to outline some of the typical attacks on Smart Scale we see every year.
Okay, so great questions. So Smart Scale is a funding prioritization mechanism that General Assembly called for a number of years ago. And we're on round 5 of it currently. And it doesn't give a priority to any mode of transportation, which is one of the things that's positive about it. In the past, we basically had sort of a black box and didn't really have much information other than once projects were put into the draft plan to be funded. And Smart Scale only applies to construction projects, so it doesn't apply to things like maintenance, which have their separate pots of money. What Smart Scale does is it sets up criteria and scoring criteria that each project gets scored on, and then the highest scoring projects, it runs a cost-benefit analysis as well, are the ones that are to be funded. So it doesn't give a specific preference for cleaner modes of transportation, but in practice, it has meant that those types of cleaner transportation are getting more funding than they did in the past from this particular pot of money. Now, don't want to go too far in the weeds, but transit and rail have their own separate pots of money under the state funding formulas, but this lets them compete head to head for some of the construction money that typically in the past they never got. In terms of what the factors are and some of the attacks that Wyatt mentioned, we were able to get in the legislation. Environment is one of the factors to be considered. Administratively, been working the past few years to get the environmental score reshaped a little bit, so there's a little more emphasis on carbon pollution. And so but it isn't, the factors are not specified in the legislation. So there is a study that was agreed to after last session to look at how Smart Scale is doing and to consider possibly changing some of the scores. Our concern, and this has been something we fought in several General Assembly sessions, is there's been a lot of push from people who don't like the fact that some of this money has gone to transit and rail and bike ped projects to significantly increase the percentage that goes to congestion reduction, which those proponents think will mean that pretty much all this money will go to highway projects. So that's a quick kind of summary of the what the program is and some of the threats that we're facing.
Thank you so much, Trip. We have a question from a different Robert. I think this one will go towards you, Karen. Will the Jim Crow laws currently on the books be identified and circulated so that we can contact our legislators? And I believe this is a reference to some of the discriminatory policies that were included in a lot of land use over the last century.
Yes, and I would say there have been some studies in the past. The Northern administration formed a task force that looked at the VA codes, and they had identified over 100, I can't remember the number, of discriminatory laws that were still in VA codes. And this was for all of them, not just the subdivision chapter. And unfortunately, I just tried looking it up, and it's no longer housed on the website. But it did make recommendations, including to look at the subdivision code. And in addition to that, McGuire Woods has just completed their study in which they identified that there have been some discriminatory codes, but they had a focus mainly on housing options and what we need to do to remove those codes to be able to have a more robust housing options that's including middle housing, you know, those things that I talked about, the fourplexes to duplexes and those types of things. And that the single family land use code had created a barrier from disallowing those types of housing options to be constructed in certain areas. So there have been some really great work done, but there has not been a really good, comprehensive, focused effort for these particular planning codes. And so before we can come up with a policy recommendation or recommendations, I would say would be more than one, I think a study would need to be conducted in which we look at it word for word and not just look for, you know, Jim Crow era, but anything that may cause discrimination based on age, ability, and all of those things needs to be reviewed, socioeconomic status and those types of things. So I think our first step would be asking, you know, getting a good study, and then from there, making those policy recommendations. So I guess what I would say to go to your legislators right now, if you want to start talking to them and setting them up, is telling them that there is a need. We do know there have been studies that have been done in the past that have identified that they are discriminatory laws and policies in our codes, and that we need to start moving to seriously remove those. Yes, I can provide the link. We need to start making efforts to remove those codes, and one of the best ways is to devote funding and resources to that study, and then the commitment to follow through on those recommendations and actually do those policy changes. And I will put the link in the chat.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen. Okay, lastly, I think this will be our last question, and I'll make it an electric vehicle combo question and combine the two questions from Robert and Dan. So firstly, there are currently EV semi-trucks being manufactured by Volvo in Dublin, Virginia. Are there incentives that could facilitate companies in-state shift to electric trucks? And then also, electric vehicles require electrical sources to charge the vehicle. Storms, which are becoming more frequent and severe, often knock out electrical distribution systems. What is being done to provide backup sources for charging vehicles? So I will pass this to Blair at Climate Cabinet.
Awesome. I'm actually going to tackle Robert's question first on how we ensure we can still charge our vehicles, fuel our vehicles when the power is out. And my response to that question is actually that when the power is out, gas stations also don't work. So applying a problem that affects ICE vehicles and requiring EVs to solve it on their own, I think is misinformation, essentially, that like we need to overcome in our community. So absolutely, power outages are an issue. We need grid modernization. We need grid stability. We need local distributed energy sources so that we are more shielded from the power outages that we see because of extreme weather. But, and for instance, that can include battery backup systems if you have solar on your home. But if the power is out, you can't charge up either of the vehicles, whether or not it's power from your own home or from the grid, or it's a gasoline vehicle or at a gas station, because that gas station also needs power to function and to have all of the safety mechanisms built in that are required for gas stations. So second question about EV trucks. And Tripp, you're more than welcome to add on to this as well, because you worked on this. Currently, no, not to my knowledge, do we have any incentives specifically for companies to purchase electrified trucks. With that being said, we did take an initial crack at a lever last year, trying to incorporate total cost of ownership calculators that were developed by the Electrification Coalition into state-based fleet procurement, so that electrifies light-duty fleets. We initially introduced the concept of how that could also be used for medium and heavy duty vehicles to drive that adoption and get more of these vehicles on the roads. At the moment, that was considered a little too technologically nascent for us to, in the Commonwealth, make that jump, but it is something that I know our coalition is going to continue to remind folks, and potentially in future years, we could look at, you know, the medium and heavy duty electrification MOUs that other states are participating in. Tripp, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Virginia did sign the medium heavy duty MOU. Just wanted to mention that. But Blair, exactly right. We don't have currently a state incentive for this. There is some federal money, though, available in the new legislation. So that will help. But Virginia needs to do a lot more in this area.
Okay, excellent. Thank y'all. That was a very punctual and fact-filled question and answer section. So now we're going to jump into the second bucket of issues we have: walking, biking, trains, and transit. So up first, we have Victoria Higgins, the Virginia Director of CCAN, that is going to be sharing some of our ideas about how we help public transportation to be fast, frequent, and affordable for Virginians.
Thanks, Wyatt, and hello, everybody. I wrote my little talking points before I heard other folks' presentations, but by now I'm sure you know that transportation is over half of our emissions in Virginia. That means we have to be laser focused on transportation sector decarbonization. And because personal vehicles are the lion's share of that, the #1 quickest way to cut carbon in Virginia overall is to reduce the number of miles that we drive, which we've been calling vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. Not to mention buying a traditional vehicle right now is super expensive and out of reach for a lot of people, with used car prices at an all-time high. And yes, we are moving towards electric vehicles in Virginia, which is a very welcome and necessary development. But it ultimately doesn't solve all of the problems created by car-dependent culture, like urban sprawl and traffic congestion. And moreover, right now, hundreds of thousands of Virginians rely on public transit to get to work, to get to the grocery store, to go to the doctor, and those transit systems are desperately underfunded. For example, riders of Hampton Roads Transit, or HRT, have dealt with almost 20,000 no-show buses per year. And that's because HRT just doesn't have the money to get the buses and the drivers to allow for reliable and frequent service. I went to the transit conference in Roanoke this past spring, and the #1 topic of discussion was not being able to keep enough drivers to fund existing routes, let alone expand to new ones because of a lack of funding. We also know overall that transit ridership is down nationwide and in Virginia in the wake of COVID. Some of that is people working from home, but a larger piece is that people got out of the habit of using transit or didn't have the money to use it. So if we're serious about transit as a climate solution, then we have to get ridership levels back up. And that's why Virginia has allowed a program called the Transit Ridership Incentive Program, or TRIP, to provide funding for zero and low fare transit. So no fares on some bus routes in a couple cities throughout Virginia. Cities and counties that have implemented zero and low fare are seeing ridership levels very close to their pre-COVID levels, and those that don't have this policy are way behind. TRIP funding also goes to promoting regional connectivity in transit systems, by the way. The governor unfortunately stuck a sunset clause on the ability for zero fare to be funded by TRIP. That date is in 2024, and that's just not long enough to let us really get people back on and comfortable with transit. So this paper calls for removing that 2024 date, and especially because the 2024 deadline has also caused localities to not implement zero fare or ask for that funding because they don't want to start a program that they know will be popular and then take it away in less than 2 years. In Virginia, we commissioned a study called the Transit Equity and Modernization Study that was championed by Delegate McQuinn. So thanks so much to Delegate McQuinn. To look at all the problems that people experience when they use public transit, assess who it most impacts, and then propose solutions. So let me actually share a summary in the chat of some of the findings from that study. There you go. And the bottom line is that a lack of transit infrastructure, so crosswalks to get to a bus stop, shelters on bus stops, or seating at bus stops, seriously limits people's desire or ability to make use of transit. And that limits their ability to move around the world and meet their basic needs. And we should keep in mind that depending on the locality, but we're often talking about low-income folks, we're often talking about Black and brown folks when we're talking about who relies on public transit and therefore whose basic needs we're not meeting. As policy recommendations, we've mentioned removing the sunset clause on TRIP, but we also need to apportion more of the general fund to transit infrastructure and transit in general. That's a battle that we're going to fight every year until the GA stops being, so myopic about roads and cars. But we're also looking for other pots of money we might be able to dip into to fund some of the recommendations called for in the Transit Equity and Modernization Study. So stay tuned all winter long for more thrilling budget news.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Yeah, hopefully we have only good news out of public transportation. We don't have to spend as much time fighting bad bills as we did last year. Fingers crossed there. Okay, up next, we have a return appearance. If you loved him talking to you about transforming transportation, just wait when he starts explaining how we're going to expand rail service across the Commonwealth. Once again, we have Trip Pollard of SELC.
Thanks, Wyatt. So it's kind of a good follow-up to the discussion of transit, and hopefully we won't be battling any cuts to our rail funding either this session. So the expanding rail paper I wrote with Danny Plugger of Virginians for High-Speed Rail. And next slide, please. Passenger rail actually is a big success story in Virginia in recent years. Virginia has actually become a national leader in a number of ways. In just the past 3 years or so, the state has announced and finalized agreements with our two major private Class 1 railroads, CSX and Norfolk Southern. And as part of those agreements, the state purchasing a total of 412 miles of right-of-way of railroads, as well as over 250 miles of railroad tracks. Also part of those agreements, Virginia is going to be constructing 50 miles of new track and doubling the capacity of the Long Bridge, which crosses the Potomac between DC and Virginia, and is an enormous bottleneck for passenger rail as well as freight rail currently. All of those things haven't been done yet, but that's the path we're on, and it's called the Transforming Rail in Virginia Initiative. So we've made some really significant steps, but we've got to build upon that success, including protecting our rail funding and to keep moving forward with this initiative, which was developed under the Northam administration. So far, the Youngkin administration has continued to follow through on it. And for years, in fact, passenger rail has received some pretty strong bipartisan support in the General Assembly. In addition to protecting the funding and this Transforming Rail initiative, we also need increased funding for a variety of reasons. One critical one is to improve the speed, frequency, and reliability of service. And then we also need to extend service to some new areas. Most of the Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative and the recent new services that Virginia has launched focus on north-south lines, predominantly in the DC to Richmond corridor, which makes a lot of sense. That's where highest ridership is, and that is a good priority. But haven't focused enough on east-west links, and so I think that's one of the areas we need some additional funding. Station modernization is another one. Our single most busy station in Virginia is Staples Mill in Richmond, which is, any of you who've been there know, underwhelming would be putting it charitably. It's a horrible facility. And then we also need to improve the multimodal connections to our stations. It's very hard to get from our stations to other activity centers currently by transit, bicycle, pedestrian means. Freight railroad, frankly, presents even greater challenges, even though it offers enormous environmental benefits in reducing pollution, as well as safety and other benefits. The problem is that privately owned companies, as I mentioned in Virginia, it's mainly CSX and Norfolk Southern, they own the rail lines, and they've been focused in recent years on downsizing and really disinvesting in their systems, which has made Wall Street very, very happy. It's boosted their short-term profits and made their, done pretty well for their stockholders, but it's not sustainable, and it certainly doesn't begin to capture the potential for freight rail to reduce pollution and congesting by shifting trucks to rail. So in that sense, with freight rail, there are fewer policy levers we have available, and there really is some significant tension between private company profit motives and the public interest. Next slide. But we do have some specific recommended policy solutions in the expanding rail paper. Some of these require legislative action, others we can pursue administratively. First and foremost, we need to protect rail funding and implement that Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative that I mentioned. If we only achieve this, it will be an important success because it will make enormous difference in our transportation pollution and also help to cut down on some of the sprawl that Karen talked about, because most of these stations are in our inner jurisdictions and helps to encourage development in those areas. Second recommendation is to advance the Commonwealth Corridor. I mentioned the relative lack of east-west connections we have in Virginia. This is a proposal that actually Danny Plugger and I wrote a paper on a few years ago that would run from Hampton Roads to Richmond, which we already have trains doing that. But then it would go from Richmond to Charlottesville, which there's no way to get to currently by rail unless you go up to DC and then back down, which is kind of crazy. And then it would also go out to Roanoke and into the New River Valley. The comments on the state rail plan are actually due next week, and this is one of the things that we've been encouraging people to call for. The rail plan does include this, but in way out years. We need to move the timetable up. Third policy solution is to fund modernization of rail stations and to provide multimodal connections between stations and activity centers. Fourth is to study opportunities to expedite the transition to zero emission rail, electric rail predominantly, although there's some interesting things being done in Europe with freight rail, especially looking at possibility for hydrogen. But as was mentioned by Blair and then Victoria mentioned in the context of transit, I think electrification is really where we need to go. We do not have electrified trains in Virginia now, whereas we do have them in the Northeast corridor. The next recommendation is to study the environmental and economic benefits of new rail versus road capacity in the 81 corridor. I mentioned the need to shift more of our truck traffic and freight to rail. I think I-81 is probably the corridor where it makes the most sense. There was some momentum for that a number of years ago. That has kind of declined with the Norfolk Southern being the main railroad there. Not looking at that capacity as much expansion, but retrenchment. But I think a study of that could help perhaps free up some public funding that would help move that forward again. And that retrenchment actually leads to the final recommendation, and that is the fact that some of our Class 1 railroads are abandoning corridors. And the recommendation is to preserve those through public purchase for rails with trails, or just rail bank them, because those corridors, if they're lost and carved up for development, you'll never get them back. And some of them are what we need for long-term connections for passenger rail to places that are not currently served. So those are our recommendations. Again, I think passenger rail has been a recent success story in Virginia, but these are recommendations to build on that success.
Hey, thank you so much, Tripp. Great flags, especially as Virginia's doing some of the most exciting rail expansions across the entire country. California's high-speed rail, I feel like, gets all the attention, but the expansions here are really kind of the bread and butter of good service.
Yeah, California's costs a lot more. We'll see if it ever actually has anywhere near the impact I think Virginia's will have.
It's great to see that Virginians of all parties can bash California. We can always find something that we don't like. Okay, up next, we are going to have increasing walking and biking, and I am going to be covering this. So here we go. Okay, can everyone see? Excellent. Okay, so as mentioned, we had some great advocates working on this paper and pulling it together from bike groups across the Commonwealth, and I'm going to cover this for them. Okay, so what we know is that 43% of people want to bicycle more. This is something that we really kind of saw borne out by the pandemic. Suddenly, with traffic gone off of the streets, biking became a paradisical way to get around, to get some exercise. And so many more people dusted off the old bikes that they had in their garage or bought new bikes and went out and hit the roads. So what we know from the pandemic is that there's a ton of demand for biking, and when people feel like it's safer for them to be able to do so, they will make that choice. The reason we're engaged on walking and biking is because it's a zero carbon emission way to get around. Over half of all trips in America are under 3 miles, so very achievable on bikes, especially on e-bikes for people who are older or have kids in tow or who may have a disability. Biking can really be a mobility boost for a lot of people. This past session, we got the first big boost in trails funding. So there's $89 million, a new Office of Trails to kind of coordinate efforts between Department of Conservation and Recreation and VDOT. So this is a huge ocean shift kind of change to trails, how they're funded and planned. But currently the money for that was only a 1-year appropriation. So we don't know what money is going to exist for trails going forward. And then also just kind of in the broader bike policy, we have a great vision for more people being able to use active transportation to get around, but we just don't have the state planning to really support that. So our state bike plan is already over a decade old, and our Complete Streets program to kind of talk about having safe roadways, that's almost 2 decades old. So there's a lot of potential for walking and biking to be a great option for us to shift people away from fossil fuel vehicles and towards cleaner ways to get around. We just don't have the infrastructure to really support people and make them feel safe as they're doing so. So the policy solutions on this, we're planning to rerun a bill that we ran last year, committing the Commonwealth to the notion of Vision Zero, which is a concept that says there should be 0 people who die on our roads in the Commonwealth. We've seen that number increasing dramatically over the past few years. So this is to kind of anchor Virginia state policy towards getting that number down to 0 by mid-century, with a goal of trying to reduce road fatalities by 50% by 2035. You wouldn't think it's controversial, but we still face a good amount of opposition there. Up next, to kind of solve the problem of having this new Office of Trails and all of this money and wonderful ideas coming from all around the Commonwealth to be funded, we're asking for lawmakers to maintain a multi-use trail budget at $41 million. We think that'll provide enough stability for localities across the state to, when they put in an application for planning funding, to know that there's going to be money waiting for them next year to build out that thing that they've been planning and really kind of connect a lot of communities across the Commonwealth. Also, as I mentioned, we've got a lot of outdated plans in Virginia. So much has changed in the way that we're thinking about walking and biking since 2011 and definitely since 2004. So asking the state to update these with current best practices would really be transformational for a lot of planning across Virginia. And then lastly, the goal is to really kind of get back to the progress that we made with the Bicyclist Safety Act. There were 3 parts to that. The safety stop, allowing cyclists to treat stop signs more like a yield so that they avoid collisions with vehicles who hit them from the back. That never passed. That went to a study that has then kind of sat on ice. And then last year, with a fake story about a jackknifed horse trailer, we lost the ability for cyclists to ride side by side, which is incredibly important for parents who want to bike with their kids and kind of keep their kids towards the side of the road and protect them. But it's also great for drivers because it really helps cyclists to form shorter lines when they're biking in rural spaces and allow for safer passing for everyone. So those 2 big safety things will still be on our radar, although the climate for pro-safety bicyclist legislation is not very positive right now. So now we are going to move back into the Q&A portion. So of the presentations that you have seen in the second half, please feel free to send in any questions you have about transit, trails, and trains. And the first question we have is more about vehicle pollution. Do we have any questions that are specifically related to the block of presenters that we just saw? Okay, I'm not getting any questions from folks. It seems that everyone just explained everything so well. So I will pass it back over to Kyle to close us out.
Well,
Hi,
I think
folks. Oops, sorry.
there are a few questions just popped up in the chat in case you wanted to take a second.
Oh, Okay, we do now have questions, so thank you to the inquisitive people out there. We have the first question: how does e-bike use affect planning? And being the current bike expert here, I will field this one. So yeah, we're seeing a huge boom in e-bike sales across the US. Last year, we had twice as many e-bikes purchased as electric vehicles. So when we really kind of talk about the electrification of transportation, we need to remember that we're not just talking about electric vehicles, we're talking about everything from e-bikes to electrified transit buses to school buses to electrifying our rail networks. We really want everything to be electric. E-bikes, it's a really wonderful mobility aid for folks. So for people who maybe never would have gotten on a bike in their lives, now they have that battery assistance to help them get where they need to go. So really it should kind of change the way we think about who bikes are for, and hopefully put a fire under people to expand those safe, protected bike lanes as much as possible, because no matter whether your bike is powered by your own legs or you get a little bit of help from a battery, mostly you just want to feel like you're not going to get run over. So hopefully e-bikes will really kind of expand the community of bicycling advocates beyond the brave souls who are willing to go out and combat traffic as it exists today. Okay. I am only getting bicycling questions, so feel free to send in anything that's not about bikes so that you can hear from people besides myself. Let's see. How can we best help to advocate for bike lanes in areas that currently have little to no bike infrastructure? Connections are great, but it can be hard to get to them. Specifically, it can be hard to get to bike lanes from certain parts of Richmond where this question sharer lives without traveling on dangerous roads or roads with no designated bike lanes. Thank you, Taylor. And this is the problem. We at VCN are very state level focused. So we're thinking about state policies, state funding, but all of our bicycling groups that we work with really are embedded in local communities. And that's where this type of advocacy comes down to. I think some of the trails budget can be really helpful. You're seeing people start to think more about how do we have branch trails and kind of feeder trails so that you can get from a community like Fulton and Richmond's East End and connect you safely with the Virginia Capitol Trail. So I think as advocacy around trails expands and the budget for these types of trails projects hopefully stays steady, we'll be able to kind of move down to that more granular approach to getting more people access to trails. And until then, a lot of it is going to come down to local advocacy of really fighting for safe, dedicated bike lanes at the municipal level. Okay, up next, do we have published data on commuting reduction due to work from home as a result of COVID? Panelists, do any of you feel comfortable speaking on the role of telework in
terms of data? There's not a huge amount yet, but actually just I think it was just yesterday, some data was released for the DC metro area on telecommuting, and it showed a significant rise in telecommuting and the number of driving trips that were reduced by COVID. Unfortunately, that same study also showed a significant increase in the number of vehicle trips with a solo driver had gone up. because of the pandemic. So I think transit is, in that study and that data, at least, which I think was through March of this year, transit was taking still a big hit in the DC metro area for work commutes, but telecommuting was, I want to say, I don't have the numbers in front of me, like 3 times the level of pre-pandemic. So it was a significant increase in a metro area that already was fairly high compared to national averages for telecommuting. So, that can help eliminate some trips. There's a lot of, I would say there's a lack of adequate data on sometimes when people telecommute, do they though make more other types of vehicle trips than they might have done otherwise, going shopping or whatever. But I do think overall telecommuting is a strategy that can help, and other things like that reduce the level of demand can help address transportation pollution. That's the only, I haven't seen a very good study elsewhere in Virginia yet on the increase in telecommuting.
Thank you, Trip. Victoria, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I just, I want to say, specifically here in Richmond, where I am, when we're talking about our zero fare policy, it's clear that there's still immense demand for transit if it is available to people, because in Richmond with our zero fare policy, if you're here, the buses are free. You should really use them. That we have a ridership levels that are about 90% of what they were pre-COVID. And that's much, much higher than places that don't have zero fare. It's not necessarily a forever solution to keep fares at zero. But in terms of getting people comfortable using transit again, as Tripp said, a lot of people, instead of taking transit to work, are driving alone. So that's one of our policy solutions to try and get folks back on transit, because we know there is still immense demand for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to add one qualifier on that DC data. Part of the reason I think the DC data is down for transit is because of particular problems right now with the metro system. They've had some cars out of service for safety reasons and other things. So very important point, Victoria. I think low and zero fare is critical to building back transit ridership, and Richmond's a perfect example.
Well, the think tanks moved to work from home in DC. We don't have as many here.
Thank you both. And I'll also add on to what Tripp was mentioning about the Metropolitan Washington Coalition of Governments report of kind of how they've met their reduction goals on reducing transportation emissions. I'm not sure that would have been possible without the huge shift to teleworking in that region. So I think the data is still being gathered since it's a pretty fresh transition, but hopefully we'll get more quantifiable data that can really show. Teleworking isn't something that we've always explicitly engaged on, but it does make a lot of sense in the framework that we're using, thinking about how we reduce vehicle miles traveled, and the trip that doesn't need to be taken is the best for the climate. So, okay. Next, we have a question from Faith Harris. Is there any thought of connecting biking infrastructure with the bus?
Sure.
Victoria.
I can answer briefly. Yeah. A lot of the items that were called for in the transit equity and modernization study were about connecting modes of transit, and certainly multimodal travel is one of those recommendations. So we will be looking this year, and I should also shout out that Faith Harris helped me write this paper. So I think she's just queuing me up for an easy answer. We're definitely looking for money to increase multimodal transit, and we will be doing that this year. So stay tuned.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And last in the Q&A, I have more of a comment of support from Stacy, but I'll just share it because it's nice to get those. Expressing that in the Eastern Shore, one of the trails that has been prioritized by lawmakers in the recent appropriation and creation of Office of Trails, that they've already removed the train rails and are replacing them with a 52-mile long trail And Stacy's excited that it will make bicycling safer for people and help reduce the potential for crashes. So, okay, well, we have gotten through all of our questions, all of our presenters. Thank you so much for tuning in to our land use and transportation update, where the issues stand before we move into the 2023 General Assembly session in just 10 weeks, I guess. Thank you all so much, and I'll hand it back over to Kyle.
Thank you, Wyatt, and thank you to our authors for coming out today and presenting. Normally next we would have our civic engagement and outreach manager, Andrew Perot, do a section on how you can be an environmental advocate coming up on the General Assembly session. In lieu of him not being available today, you are kind of stuck with me. So I'll do my best today. So you can, first up, you can contact your legislator and let them know about any environmental or any issues that you are currently pondering in or wanting to advocate on. If you can't find your legislator, you can always go to who'smylegislator.virginiageneralassembly.gov. It's a great website. I've used it myself, and when we have to do scheduling for certain things, I will use it for other people. I just checked it out to see if it's been updated or anything. There is actually a section that will let you know if your district is currently changing. My delegate and Senate district are currently changing, so that's pretty exciting news. You can also download a PDF copy of our common agenda, as well as our advocacy guide. And you can take those with you. You can use those for when you contact your legislator. You can use those for any advocacy action that you will be taking on the issues you really care about. Early voting has already started September 23rd and ends November 5th, and in person November 8th. Let's see. Oh, and I already skipped it, but Andrew's email, if you have any questions for Andrew, you can email him as well. You can also go to our VCN Take Action webpage, where it will give you more information on how to get out and vote, as well as give you information on upcoming resources that you can utilize, as well as information on how to take further action. With all that said, if you have any more questions about advocacy, I may not be the guy to ask. It's more of a question for Andrew. So you could send your questions to me and I'll send them to Andrew, or you can go on our about page on our VCN website and you could find Andrew's email there, as well as any of our program staff's emails who might be relevant to an issue that you are particularly caring about. With that said, our next event, which will be Thursday, the 27th, is our Good Governance and Virginia Budget educational event. We'll be talking about promoting environmental justice, educating for environmental literacy, and investing in clean air, clean water, and healthy lands for all. This list is kind of subject to change. We might have another paper pop up or a author who may not make it, but currently this is the papers that we'll be talking about next Thursday on the 27th at 11. With all that said, go have a great lunch. Had a great time. Hope to see you next time. If you have more questions, please reach out and we will make sure it gets to the appropriate person. But thank you very much. Have a good day.